I never liked his tactics. The man lied. I mean, he lied about me on more than one occasion, you know, in publications, on his storefront, just outright.
Oh, he had no problem with authority. He didn't respect it at all.
He's a very passionate person. And he very strongly believes and can see the problems that this country is facing, and I think it creates a sense of urgency in him that he allows to overwhelm him.
I would think his belief has to be sincere because the political ideas he espouses are so simple-minded.
I'd have to say that Marc Emery's really a hero. He's the most courageous man I've ever met.
You have to experience Marc personally. You can't read about him. You can't do a media thing or get a media image. You've got to meet Marc on a one-to-one basis and talk to him. That's when you find out who Marc Emery really is.
He left Canada because it was a prison to him. He was heralded as a political crusader and condemned as a media manipulator. He could be eloquent and charismatic on one topic and arrogant and juvenile on another. But he never cared about the consequences of his words or his actions. Marc Emery said and did the things that were important to him, and nothing and no one could intimidate him.
You know, when I come into the homes of people watching this, I'm going to offend virtually every single person. If I don't offend every single person, I'm not doing my job, because every Canadian's got a lot to be called up on a carpet for.
Recreationally, we have been made enemies of the very people we pay taxes to keep afloat. And it's time we turned around and told them, fuck you.
Once there was a silly old ram, thought he'd punch a hole in a dam. No one could make that ram scram. He kept butting that dam 'cause he had high hopes.
Marc Scott Emery was born in London, Ontario, a few hours before Valentine's Day, 1958. He was the second son of working-class English immigrants and their first child to be born in Canada.
I remember having a remarkably idyllic childhood in the sense that I saw only frontiers to be explored, and there were no limitations when I grew up. I fear that children today don't grow up with such a sense of potential that I grew up. I grew up thinking that there was no such thing as limitations on one's potential, capabilities.
He was an entrepreneur from the start. He made money running carnivals in his backyard, charging his friends admission, and giving away his old toys as prizes.
Marc always had an enterprise on the go, and I think other kids would gather around Marc because of that. In the beginning it might have been a freshie stand selling Kool-Aid on the sidewalk. Like, he would think of things, ingenious ways to make money, before the rest of us would even think of doing that. We'd have a paper out and we'd deliver the papers. We'd never think of getting a paper out and then hiring smaller kids to do the deliveries and make a profit on it and then take that profit and invest it in something else.
He wanted some self-esteem. He wanted to be known by his friends and the community. He was very proud of the work he did. He was very proud of prompt and efficient service. He was proud of satisfying his customers. He was proud of knowing these customers and having them know him. He was proud of turning something that everybody else just thought was a hobby into a source of revenue.
But Emery was interested in more than making money.
And now, Dick Tracy.
Like many young boys, he found adventure in comic books. Dick Tracy was an early favorite, and the square-jawed detective would make an impression on him.
Justice is a very key thread that runs through a lot of my early influences, in the same way that I was interested in the Dick Tracy comics. When I began to get into the comic book business when I was 11, 12, and 13, I came across old Dick Tracy strips, and Dick Tracy was an incorruptible person pursuing with incredible zeal the pursuit of justice. The concepts of law and order there, when I was young, were synonymous with justice. I believe that Dick Tracy went against the contemporaries of his time. He had corrupt politicians, gangsters, killing people in the streets. He used the aegis of law and order, but what he really sought was justice.
Emery's mother always hoped her son would go to Harvard and become a doctor, but Emery had other plans. After stints as a newspaper carrier, a snow shoveler, and a stamp seller, Emery started a successful mail-order comic business. He was 11 years old.
Well, Marc showed very early in his life that he wanted to be a businessman. He was very proud of the fact that he was the first kid to have his own little business out of his house, and then his first kid to have his own little business out of the back of a store, and the first kid to have his own store, and first kid to have his weekly newspaper in town. He wanted to do it first, he wanted to do it best, he wanted to do it slick with a lot of pizzazz, and he wanted to shake up people. He wanted to wake them up, get their attention, and say, what do you think of this?
By his teenage years, Emery's mail-order business was booming. Cartons of comic books had taken over several rooms in his parents' home, and profits were climbing. But there was just one problem. Emery still had to go to school.
He would challenge your right to give him a problem. He likely would challenge the way in which you would solve the problem. And he likely would challenge you on, why are we doing this? What good is it? You got answers, whether you wanted them or not. I can always remember him having the answers. But we got along really well when I encouraged him to think out the kind of thing he was working with, rather than telling him what to think would make a model answer.
By grade 10, Emery was still juggling homework with a budding business career. He managed to maintain a B average in his studies, but there was only one thing he cared about: skipping classes.
I never had arguments with my parents, but the social system around my home I thought was completely illegitimate. I mean, I wasn't petulant and rebelling for nothing. I would try and give them very credible explanations about why I thought the school system was inherently flawed and why this was bad for me and why Mom and Dad, you know, I've got a business career ahead of me. I really like doing this, and I don't think school is going to be influential one way or the other. And to a large degree, they accepted this because I think they were just kind of awestruck that this 13-year-old had intellectual arguments for why this was unsuitable for me.
In March of 1975, Emery went to Europe and the Mediterranean on a class trip. At the time, he planned on graduating from grade 12 and purchasing a used bookstore in downtown London. But when he returned home, the owner of the shop threatened to sell the business to someone else if Emery didn't take charge immediately. So at the age of 17, Marc Emery had a store and no high school diploma.
And I got an opportunity to quit school, and I sold my comic book business for $10,000 in 1975, and I moved in here, and I even lived in the back of my store for the first year, which was wonderful. All a single guy needed at age 17 was a big bed, especially a big bed, and a stereo system and a refrigerator, and I was made, and I thought nothing better in life could be had. So I was extremely happy in 1975 over the prospects of living in the back of what most people would refer to as a dingy used bookshop.
Emery put in 70-hour weeks. By the fall, he was clearing over 1,000 books a week. He christened the prosperous little store City Lights. It would be the first of several bookshops and kiosks for the young businessman.
Certainly the bookstore was a very good moneymaker, yeah. And Marc, of course, if anyone who knows anything about books realizes very quickly that Marc does not. The one blessing about City Lights is that the prices are horrendously cheap. And I mean, just scandalously cheap. So even though when you go in there, everything's misfiled and you have to wade through 98% dross to get to the real bits of gold, when you do find something worth having, the price is a steal. He certainly knew the comic market, but no, Marc himself had very little to do with the success of City Lights, I'm convinced. I used to go in there, as I say, even before I worked there, strictly for the books, but you don't get out of there without listening to at least a mini lecture from Marc. So yeah, he was always there, and we used to talk a lot. And we disagreed, I think, about as completely as it's possible for two people in any one city to disagree on almost everything. And yet I think we enjoyed each other. I certainly enjoyed him. I don't wish him ill, but I do think he's too much. I think he's preposterous. And I think he'd probably return the compliment in full measure.